They take us in the night. They introduce their instruments, and thus their reality, into our brains. It is, however, too easy to call them evil, just as it is too easy to say that they are saints, kindly guides from the beyond. They are a very real and immensely complex force, the provocative nature of which demands neither hate nor love, but rather respect in a context of intellectual objectivity and emotional strength. Whitley Strieber, author, experiencer. Experience 1. Intruders, Zetas, and Amiko. June 6th, 2021, 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. For whatever reason, I'm writing this on September 28th, several months after the experience occurred. I've had 3 more since. When this first happened, it was unbelievable and unlike anything I'd ever experienced. A few days before it happened, I was feeling lost in a spiritual sense, and so I reached out to my spirit guides, asking them to reveal themselves, saying vehemently that I was ready to really see them in physical form. And although that still hasn't happened, I believe these experiences were a direct response to my request. Several days prior, I'd been speaking to Victoria about her recent experiences of meeting her spirit guides, extraterrestrials, and other entities, and although I wanted to believe her, not having had these experiences myself made me skeptical. I've known her my entire life, and she hadn't experienced anything like this in the past, as far as I knew. So why now? So after our call, I felt sort of irked, because I'd been asking my spirit guides and the ETs very sincerely, and perhaps desperately, to visit me in this way for almost a decade with very little results. I suppose I felt jealous at the fact that Victoria had seemed to only recently venture into this realm and was getting immediate results. I, on the other hand, had been on a mission to understand my childhood experiences, and all I was getting was radio silence. I felt slighted and ignored. So this fueled me to ask my spirit guides once and for all to bring me into the fold. I wanted to have the same kind of experiences that Victoria and her friend Logan had been having. That all probably sounds petty, but a big part of me did believe her, and so I was not only motivated by my desire to finally get answers, but I also felt like I needed to know for myself what she was experiencing so that I could determine whether or not I should intervene or protect her in some way. The knee-jerk protective older brother instinct kicked in, and I was afraid she might be opening herself up to being violated by negative entities, and I really wanted to see for myself what this was all about. A couple days later, after I had some time to process what she'd told me, I decided to speak directly to my guides with deep sincerity, like gearing up to say a prayer about something you really need help with, sort of pulling your whole self back into your body and giving it all your intention. I remember I was in the car on the way home from therapy, with nothing but time and the road in front of me, and I asked them, "If you exist, and it's within your power, I give you permission to visit me in physical form, or by whatever means you can, in order to establish a more fluid line of communication between us and develop a closer relationship throughout the rest of my journey on Earth. I need to know who you are, who I am, and what the meaning of my life is." This is, of course, paraphrased, as I'm sure that what I actually said was not so concise or well thought out, but that's the gist of it. When speaking to beings that you can neither see nor hear, it is difficult or impossible to know if you've made your message clear, or if they've even heard you at all. You have to learn a new language, a kind of shamanic ability to interpret your external environment in order to receive their reply. Usually they communicate in synchronicities, external stimuli, which seems to be in sync with the internal processes of the mind and/or the heart. Oftentimes, I will either see a flash of blue, purple, white, and sometimes red light in the room, as small as a grain of sand and as bright as a star. Or I'll see the same number or sequence of numbers all throughout the day, or sometimes weeks, accompanied by an inner knowing that my message has been received. Sometimes, however, there's nothing that I've reached out to them for, and yet I'll still see these things, and the inner knowing tells me that they are reaching out to me as if to say, pay attention to this moment, or everything you're worrying about right now is going to be okay. This is how I interpret their various attempts to communicate. They seem to be able to tap into the very fabric of time and space, whereby all things are connected, and they use loopholes in our awareness to sneak things in to get our attention. Other times the message is even clearer, and I'll have a song stuck in my head for literally days, and it won't go away until I read the lyrics and try to decipher how this song might apply to what's currently going on in my life. Usually, there is either one line that repeats in my head, or it could be the overall message of the song that I'm supposed to pay attention to. If this happens to you, I'd recommend not brushing it off, but entertaining the possibility that it could be a message from your guides, or even yourself. Think about the lyrics. If a part is repeating, try to see how that applies to your current situation. Sometimes the answer isn't literal. It's more like how a dream would communicate something in metaphors. This time, however, I reached out to them with passionate intention, and days went by without even the slightest hint of a sign that they had heard me. I tend to get anxious and grow impatient if my request isn't granted in short order, so after asking them the first time and having nothing happen, I persisted until something did. I was standing in the shower with little concern for my state of undress. They're spirits, they see it all. I told them, I don't care if you think I'll be afraid. I don't care if it scares the shit out of me. I will get over it. I just want to rip this Band-Aid off, and I want you to show yourselves to me. I know you're there. I know you can hear me. I know you can see me. Show me what happened when I was a kid with the nightmares, and why I feel like an alien, and why I've seen so many UFOs. What the hell is going on? I'm ready for the truth, even if it scares me. There was much more that I said, and it certainly wasn't in those exact words, but that's as much as I can remember. So, a couple of days after I addressed my guides in the shower, it was the date of the music video shoot for State of Mind for my band, The Dead Sages. Vanessa and I got home after having been in the city all day and had a normal evening like any other. Around that time, my snoring had gotten much worse, and so I started sleeping in the guest room so that Vanessa could get more restful sleep. It's important to note that I was sleeping alone when this happened. That evening, I was having trouble sleeping, and so I watched several videos from YouTube to await a sufficient level of tiredness. One of the videos was a tarot card reading, in which there were 4 different cards facing down, and on top of each card was placed a small metallic charm. One of the charms was an infinity symbol. This was what caught my eye as I was scrolling to settle on what to watch. I had recently been creating the branding for the Dead Sages and had been using the infinity symbol a lot. I liked the idea of using that because of its meaning to me and how it relates to the law of one material, among other reasons. So, given that I'd just finished recording the music video for our song that day, this was fresh in my mind and stood out to me as a blaring synchronicity that I needed to follow. Upon watching the video, it turned out that if you had selected the deck with the infinity symbol, it meant that you were most likely a starseed, according to the woman doing the reading. She said something like, "Oh, whenever I get this card, it means this message is for starseeds." So I immediately knew from that point that the synchronicity had not led me astray. This was not an uncommon occurrence for me, but I find it interesting considering the events that followed. It was about 12 a.m. at this point. I was feeling more lethargic and ready for something a little less engaging. I put on a guided meditation by YouTuber and clairvoyant healer Callista called Self-Love Kundalini Meditation. And throughout the video, She guides you through a sort of Reiki session of self-love and healing. Her voice is very soothing, so she puts me to sleep really nicely whenever I listen to her videos. In this case, however, I was able to stay awake throughout the whole video, and one interesting thing to note, which will become relevant later, is that during this meditation she asks you to put your hands over your sacral chakra, between the groin and the belly button, and then your third eye, slightly above and between the eyebrows, and then your heart chakra, the center of your chest, and repeat the words, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you, whilst moving your hands over these areas continually. Once the video finished, I pushed my phone aside and rolled over onto my stomach with my head facing the right side of the bed, such that my right ear was facing up, and almost as soon as I did this, I heard a very loud, high-pitched ringing in my right ear, which lasted for a couple of seconds. Once it stopped ringing, I lost consciousness immediately. I'm not sure how much time passed, but the next thing I knew, I was on my back, being pulled out of my body by two entities whose appearance was blurry and difficult to see. It was as if they were reaching inside my physical body to pull out my astral body. They pulled me quickly and with purpose until I found myself at the foot of my bed on my knees. At this time, my mattress was on the floor without a bed frame. The two entities were on either side of me, holding me there. I couldn't move, but I knew that I was no longer in my body. I couldn't turn my head, but I knew my body was still on the mattress behind me. I didn't feel any pain from my knees being on the hard linoleum floor as I normally would. Once I got a sense of what was going on, I looked closer at these beings, who seemed to have shape-shifted into more human-like forms, but it was obvious they were not human. They changed from being unclothed, ghostly, beige, Zeta-type beings to wearing button-down shirts with ties around their necks, some sort of goofy hair, and disproportionate human-like faces. It was laughable, and in some way disarmed me from being afraid of them, almost like they had a sense of humor, or perhaps I just found them to be funny in the way that a dog or cat is funny, in the sincerity of their absurd actions. What I will frequently refer to as Zetas are beings who are believed to originate from the Zeta Reticuli system, according to ufologists. They have a very distinct appearance, but manifest in varying shapes, sizes, and colors. These beings are typically very thin, with large heads, large almond-shaped eyes, sometimes with all black lenses or with pupils, irises, etc., and are completely hairless. Their ears, nostrils, and mouths are proportionally much smaller than on humans, and they communicate almost exclusively using telepathy. Zetas are the most common type of extraterrestrial that have been reported by experiencers throughout the globe, and are usually referred to as the Greys, named after their gray skin color. Zetas, however, are not always the same color, nor do they all have the same body type. In my case, they were as thin as sticks and beige in color. Once I had spent a sufficient amount of time coming to terms with what these beings looked like, I became restless about being held in place, unable to move. I wiggled fiercely to break their hold on me, and after some struggle, I managed to get loose. As soon as I did this, I immediately found myself being pulled backwards into my body by a strong suction-like force. Some time passed, and I may have lost consciousness again, too. For about 10 years or perhaps longer, I've been fascinated by the idea of astral projection, having attempted it countless times with no success. I've experienced a few brief, accidental, out-of-body incidences, but I was never able to achieve this level of separation. I could never pass a certain threshold, but these entities were able to easily yank me out. I heard the ringing again and was pulled out of my body a second time, into the same position as before. But this time they allowed me to float around the room, and I was able to catch a glimpse of one of them. He resembled the beige-looking beings detailed in Whitley Strieber's Communion, or almost exactly how they were portrayed in the film, with the exception being that he was much more ghostly. His entire body was translucent. He moved around in a very strange fashion, like a dancing spider or a plastic bag in the wind. I made several attempts to grab this being, and at some point I got a hold of his neck with both hands, like Homer Simpson strangling his son Bart. But the entity sort of laughed at me telepathically, which was a strange experience because I didn't hear anything. There was more of a knowing. I knew he was laughing at me, but it wasn't to belittle me. It was because there was nothing I could possibly do to harm him, and he knew that. These beings eventually dissipated, and I was left in this out-of-body state, free to roam. At this point, I remember hearing footsteps from outside the house, the pitter-pattering of childlike footsteps out on the old wooden deck, and although I was in my astral body, I could still hear what my physical ears were hearing. It was my physical ears that heard the footsteps, leading me to conclude that although I was in an astral state, something very real was also happening outside the house as well as inside. When I closed my astral eyes, it was as if I could tune into my physical body and check in with what it was sensing. The sound of the footsteps alarmed me, and so this prompted me to leave the bedroom and see what was going on. I might add that if I had not been in this altered state, hearing footsteps would have been significantly more terrifying because of the thought of an intruder and having to defend myself. Yet, in this altered state, I was considerably braver or stupider than usual. I opened the bedroom door and turned left into the master bedroom where Vanessa sleeps. To my astonishment, she was not there. Instead, there was a blonde woman sleeping in our bed, with a small little girl resting in a child's pose on top of her. The child's pose is a common yoga pose where the body is positioned face down with the knees tucked under the abdomen. I couldn't see either of their faces, but I saw their blonde hair. The girl had to have been about 2 or 3. This gave me a weird feeling, mostly just because I didn't expect to see that. But on some level, I knew this wasn't actually our house, even though it was identical to it. And even though Vanessa wasn't there, I knew somehow that she was safe asleep in her real bed. Upon reflection, I felt as though they might have been showing me a hybrid child created from the woman on the bed and my genetic material, which is common of these types of experiences. The woman was either human or Pleiadian, having no alien features. This only lasted for a minute or so, though, because I was determined to confront the intruders, and so I turned around and made my way down the hall to the living room, where the sliding glass doors, which lead to the backyard, were ajar. There were 2 more beings like the ones I'd seen before in my bedroom, one standing in the doorway with 1 foot up on the bottom of the door frame, as you would do if you were sneaking into a building, but paused while caught in the act, and the other further away outside in the backyard. As soon as they realized that I could see them, they shape-shifted into the same goofy-looking humans as before, wearing neckties and button-down shirts with wig-like hair and hollow eyes. This was either some kind of defense mechanism where they planted these images in my head, or they were actually able to physically shapeshift. I'm still unsure whether they were doing this to protect themselves or me. When reading Whitley Strieber's aforementioned book, Communion, years later, I was surprised to learn that not only did the beings I encountered look anatomically the same as he described, but they even dressed in a similar way as well. Here is a short excerpt where he describes this. Beside my bed, and perhaps 2 feet away from my face, close enough to see it plainly without my glasses, was a version of the thin ones, the type I have called her. It was not quite right, though. Its eyes were like big black buttons, round rather than slanted. It appeared to be wearing an inept cardboard imitation of a blue double-breasted suit, complete with a white triangle of a handkerchief sticking out of the pocket. The moment I approached them, I said something like, "You're not supposed to be here." and in a matter of seconds my attention was drawn towards a room to my left, which normally isn't there. There were several people sitting down on a couch and chairs in this new room, and it was as if a memory of them was instantly implanted into my brain, because I felt myself transition from being alarmed by the intruders to wondering why my roommates were meeting with people at 2 a.m. My focus gently shifted from thinking they were alien intruders to being upset at my inconsiderate roommates that had woken me up. I don't have roommates. I live with my wife, Vanessa, and her mother. The people that I saw in that room do not exist, but I didn't realize that until I awoke out of the altered state hours later. I said something to the roommates like, "Hey, you guys woke me up. Can you keep it down? I'm trying to sleep." There were nods of acknowledgement about what I had said, but no verbal replies. This seemed sufficient to my less than conscious self, so I decided it made sense for me to make my way back to bed. It is interesting that I was so easily confused after having gone from seeing a blonde woman in Vanessa's bed, to investigating the mysterious footsteps I had heard outside, to seeing ETs entering my house, and then, in an instant, thinking I was up and about simply because of some loud, non-existent roommates. I suspect that this was all improvised by the intruders to de-escalate my concern about their intrusion and lull me back into a state of calm. I don't think the purpose, however, was to get me back to bed, but rather to prepare me, or stall me, for what was about to happen next. As I made my way down the hall, I suddenly felt incredibly sleepy, until everything went completely black. When I regained consciousness, I found myself in a large open space, emanating white light. It was a dome-like structure, although I don't remember seeing any borders or edges. There were no windows or doors that I could see. It looked like some kind of cafeteria with sets of tables and chairs, and even something that looked like a self-serve area with waist-high rails where one might place a food tray. At first, this place seemed completely vacant, but as I got closer to one of the tables, I was taken aback by the sudden appearance of my deceased paternal grandparents sitting at this table. They looked just as they had in their later years, old but happy, sitting together at this table looking up at me. I was shocked and amazed to see them, but after a few seconds I was overcome with the strong suspicion that this couldn't really be them. These must be more shapeshifters, I thought. I said to them point blank, "You're not supposed to be here." I remember some kind of intercom system being triggered when I said that, but I don't remember what I heard. The next thing I knew, I was being slowly surrounded and bombarded by these lanky beige entities I'd seen before. There were so many of them that it made me feel claustrophobic. They kept getting closer and closer until I began to sink down into the floor, as though I was being trampled. Before I could make sense of what was going on, though, I lost consciousness completely as everything went black again. As soon as I regained consciousness, I found myself lying on the floor of my bedroom, perpendicular to the mattress, with my feet facing the door. This, in and of itself, would have perplexed me, but my attention was immediately drawn to a short female Zeta who appeared to be straddling my stomach. This was the most lucid part of the experience, as if everything had been leading up to this moment. I remember the feeling of waking up washing over me as I noticed her. I was still out of body, but considerably more lucid than the quality of experiences I had just had. This was almost indistinguishable from a waking state. I remember just taking a moment to analyze the texture of her skin and the way the light was hitting her face. She had long black hair, eyes like a human, but much larger. I think her irises were green or maybe purple. And strangely, she was wearing some kind of teal-colored eyeshadow and some very subtle rose color on her cheeks as well. She looked like a hybrid consisting of an East Asian-looking human and a typical gray Zeta. Her figure was almost adolescent-like, or even childlike. She couldn't have been more than 4 feet tall, and her body and limbs were all much thicker and more full compared to the non-hybrids, as you might imagine. Oddly enough, the thing that most caught my attention was her makeup. It was peculiar to see a being such as her wearing makeup of all things, reminiscent of that scene in Spielberg's movie E.T., where the kids dress the alien in a hat and makeup to disguise him. But she looked beautiful to me. I just had no precedent for an alien wearing makeup. I said to her with amazement, telepathically, "Whoa, is this what you really look like?" referring to the Greys and/or aliens in general. At long last, I was actually seeing an ET up close in the kind of high definition that only the human eye can display, and I was enchanted. I was still feeling drugged and impaired in that unique way that I've only ever experienced during these encounters. It's sort of like being drunk or being on a potent psychedelic. You know it's real, but at the same time, you don't have all your faculties available. After I got over the initial euphoria of seeing her, I realized that she had been chanting almost the entire time, "I love you, I love you. I love you, I love you," just like the meditation I'd been doing before bed. When she noticed that I was starting to become more aware of her, she stopped chanting, and the room was silent. I was taken aback because I suddenly realized that I felt very close to her, and we began speaking telepathically to each other. I said something like, "You're the reason I've never been happy on Earth." In that moment, I remember that I missed her, and it was painful to be away from her, like a huge part of me is always missing. It is a powerfully strange experience to feel a longing for someone you didn't remember existed. As I continued to look up at her, I noticed that she was holding a purple-colored glass object and putting it up to her mouth. It looked like she was preparing drugs using an unfamiliar process. This was essentially what was happening. The object was shaped not unlike a cannabis pipe, tunneled out in the center all the way through, but with a round bulb on both ends. She proceeded to put one end of the pipe to her lips, and bending over closer to me, put the other end of the pipe to my lips. She moved her head forward slightly, and then said, "Oops, I got some of the serum." This was not telepathic. She actually spoke this time with her tiny mouth. I was immediately concerned for her, even though I had no idea what she was giving me, and whether or not it was good or bad for me. In this strange state of consciousness, I had little concern for my own safety, but I was certainly concerned about hers. After realizing that she had taken some of the serum, I said, "Are you going to be okay?" She replied, "Yes." She then tried again, putting her lips against the pipe and blowing into it, so that whatever was inside was intended to go into my mouth and lungs, perhaps. I have no idea what this mysterious serum was, but the second she blew into the pipe, I felt very drowsy, and everything went black. I woke up back in bed with the strangest feeling of not having slept at all, which is to say, all the typical groggy feelings that one might experience while transitioning from being asleep to being awake were entirely absent. Imagine going from being drunk or high to being instantly sober within the snap of your fingers. That was what it was like. I looked at my phone to see what time it was, and it was 6 a.m. This entire experience had lasted a total of 6 hours. Stranger still was that the date was June 6th, so that's the 6th day of the 6th month at 6 a.m., after having had a 6-hour experience. 6666. Interesting timing. Another thing I realized as I was doing some research on the beings we call Zetas is that the word Zeta is the 6th letter of the Greek alphabet and is used in the naming of stars to denote the 6th star in the constellation. That's a lot of sixes, and I know what you're probably thinking. Mark of the Beast vibes? But this was not angels and demons. This was something else entirely. I had potentially been to another dimension, or several. I may have seen the afterlife where my grandparents currently reside. What was I being shown? What were the implications of this? I laid there in bed, going over the whole experience in my mind, recounting every detail as best I could. I wanted to remember it all, because it was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. After I'd finished recounting everything in its entirety, the image of the female Zeta I had spent the most time with towards the end was still lingering vividly in my mind. When I focused on her, I asked the ETs or my spirit guides, whomever, does she have a name? And without any delay, the name Amiko popped into my head in direct response to my question. At first, I had my doubts about the authenticity of this name, but I eventually accepted it, whether it was true or not. I had to call her something. I liked the idea that I had made an ET friend, even if she might have been trying to poison me. At least I finally had a name I could call upon, a specific individual to reach out to. Before, I used to look up at the stars almost every night, hoping for a passing UFO. And when they'd finally arrive and float overhead like some luminous ghost in the night, or day as the case may be, I'd speak to them without knowing who they were, or whether or not they could hear me. I've seen more UFOs than I can count at this point, so in some way, I've known that they've been aware of me. I just don't know who they are. At least Amiko was the first individual that I've met, an actual face behind the light ships. So after receiving Amiko's name and lying there in a daze, I was still extremely tired. I felt like a person who's been on an adventure all night instead of resting. But I was afraid to go back to sleep for fear of forgetting all the details about what I saw. I wish I'd had the energy to get out of bed immediately and write it all down. But instead I gave in to the fatigue and fell back to sleep. For some reason, it's taken me months to write this down, and I know I'm leaving out so many important details. Yet another lesson to be learned from these experiences. The next day I was in a daze, confused and baffled, questioning my sanity and wondering if this would happen again. At the time, I just remember feeling immense gratitude for the experience. I felt like I had seen things that most people only dream of. One thing was certain. This experience had fundamentally changed me, leaving an indelible impression. My perspective on life was forever altered, simply by the fact that I knew for certain now that some part of us can leave our body and explore other adjacent realms. The implications of this, particularly with respect to death and dying, gave me new life. I felt as though all the crippling fear of death that I'd carried with me my entire life was now washed away by the idea that I had just left my body for 6 hours and convened with interdimensional travelers from other lifetimes, timelines, planets, galaxies, perhaps even universes. Not only that, but the fact that there were other realms to explore was all the proof I needed to know for certain that what we call reality is much vaster and more mysterious than most of us would like to believe. Not only was outer space teeming with life, but so was inner space and beyond. And there was nothing to fear about what comes after death, just more adventures in different forms, in different places, with new life forms and some familiar faces. What had I just stumbled upon? Was this what Ram Dass used to call doing your astral work? Or did I just get taken advantage of by some mischievous aliens? I had so many questions in the days and weeks that followed, but one thing I had an answer to was the question I had asked my guides before this all started. What happened to me when I was a kid with the nightmares? This is what happened. I just didn't know what it was or how to deal with it as a 6-year-old boy. Somewhere inside of me, that same 6-year-old boy was relieved to finally know and to have it all click and make sense after 30 years of searching.